Imagine a country, roughly the size of New Jersey,
Right.
no agricultural heartlands, no rivers, and like less than 5 inches of rain a year.
Which is practically nothing.
Exactly. So, by all historical logic, human geography tells us this environment should be totally uninhabitable, right? Or at least, maybe sparsely populated by nomadic communities.
Yeah, that's what you would expect.
But instead, it is one of the wealthiest places on Earth, and essentially 100% of its population lives in these dense, modern cities. So today, we're taking a deep dive into the data to find out how a nation survives and actually thrives when the traditional rules of human geography just, do not apply.
We are looking at a massive multi-dimensional data stack today. It's a really comprehensive assessment report on the national development and sustainability of Kuwait.
And it's heavy stuff, right?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
But we aren't just going to rattle off numbers from a spreadsheet. I mean, this is a profound data narrative stitched together from really heavy-hitting institutions.
Like the World Bank.
Right, the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, the UN population prospects, and even these incredibly granular local trackers, like the Kuwait Nutrition Surveillance System.
So our mission today for you, the listener, is to decode what happens when extreme wealth, an exploding population, and an economy built entirely on just like a single commodity all collide in a really harsh desert environment.
Yeah, it's a fascinating paradox.
So let's start with the literal foundation, right? The ground they walk on. The data calls this the urban desert, and the baseline numbers are just stark.
They really are.
The total land area is rigidly set at roughly 17,820 square kilometers.
And that fixed landmass is subjected to an incredibly harsh climate baseline. I mean, the World Bank data tracks the average annual precipitation depth at just 121 millimeters.
Okay, let me visualize 121 millimeters for a second. That is less than 5 inches for an entire year.
Yeah, it's almost hard to wrap your head around.
If you live in a city like London or Seattle or Tokyo, you get that much rain in a single, particularly wet month. You simply cannot grow a society's food supply with 5 inches of rain. It makes zero sense.
It creates a condition of extreme water stress. I mean, traditional agriculture relies on natural watersheds, right? Or predictable rainfall.
Or at least some extensive groundwater reservoirs that replenish over time.
Exactly. But if you look at the agricultural land data in our sources, the physical footprint of arable land is practically non-existent.
It's just not there.
Right. The land under cereal production or, permanent crops is essentially a statistical rounding error.
It really makes me think of building a massive state-of-the-art space station.
Oh, that's a good analogy.
You are constructing this incredibly complex, high-tech society in an environment that is actively hostile to human biology. You can't just step outside the airlock and forage for food.
No, definitely not.
Every single calorie, every piece of material, it all has to be imported. And every single person has to live inside the habitable modules.
And in this data narrative, those habitable modules are the dense coastal urban centers.
Right.
The demographic trend lines show an urbanization rate that climbs relentlessly, decade over decade, until it essentially captures the entire population.
Which is wild.
The rural population metric simply plummets to near zero. But what is truly fascinating is a specific metric the sources use. They measure urban land area where elevation is below 5 meters.
Wait, below 5 meters. So they aren't just urbanized, they are hyper-concentrated right on the coastline.
Exactly. The vast majority of the population is clustered in this dense coastal urban reality. And the largest city alone captures an overwhelming majority of the demographic footprint.
Because building infrastructure out in the deep desert is wildly inefficient.
Right, the cost would be astronomical.
If you are running a space station, you don't spread the crew out. You need centralized water desalination, centralized power plants, centralized air conditioning grids.
You have to cluster the population where the life support pipes and the power grids can actually reach them.
Yeah, but running the life support for a society of this scale in an extreme environment, that has to be astronomically expensive.
Oh, it is. It requires a macroeconomic engine capable of generating an immense continuous surplus.
And that's where the GDP data comes in, right?
The data here tracks a gross domestic product that grew from about $1.2 billion in the 1960s to over $135 billion by 2022.
That's a massive leap. And the purchasing power parity, the gross national income, it puts them consistently at the very top of global rankings.
The wealth distribution creates a highly affluent consumer base, yeah.
But looking at the charts for the annual GDP growth rate in the sources, it doesn't look like a smooth climb.
No, not at all.
It looks like an erratic heartbeat. You have these massive peaks followed by incredibly deep valleys.
That erratic heartbeat is the signature of a single commodity resource exporting economy.
Because it's all oil.
Exactly.
Yeah.
When your macroeconomic structure is deeply tied to global fossil fuel markets, your domestic GDP is essentially a mirror of global commodity prices.
You're at the mercy of the market.
You see this volatility captured perfectly in the GDP deflator series, which measures the price levels of all domestically produced goods and services.
And the most severe drop is right around 1990 and 1991, right?
Yes, during the Gulf War, where the economic disruption was just absolute. But even outside of conflict, the normal boom and bust market cycles of oil create this intense economic whiplash.
There is a statistic in the trade data that actually broke my brain for a second.
Which one?
It shows trade as a percentage of GDP frequently exceeding 100%, and sometimes breaking 140%.
Yeah, that's a wild metric.
How is that even possible? How can a country trade more than its entire domestic economy?
It comes down to the mechanics of how we measure an economy versus how we measure trade.
Okay, unpack that for me.
So GDP measures the value added within a country's borders. Trade, which is the sum of all imports and exports, measures the gross value of goods moving across those borders.
Okay, gross versus net.
Right. When a country exports massive volumes of a high-value commodity like oil and simultaneously has to import almost every single consumer good.
Every piece of industrial equipment.
Exactly. And all of its food. The combined gross value of that movement easily dwarfs the domestic value-added economy.
So it functions almost like a massive global processing hub. The sheer volume of wealth flowing in and out of the ports is bigger than what they are physically building or manufacturing inside the country.
That's exactly it.
The current account balance must fluctuate wildly based on whatever oil is selling for that year.
Oh, it does. In boom years, the trade surplus is staggering. And that surplus is what funds the high per capita purchasing power and pays for the massive imports required to run the cities.
But with that kind of per capita wealth, with those massive sovereign wealth funds sitting in reserve, does the volatility even matter to the average person living there?
That's a great question.
It seems like they have an infinite cushion to ride out the valleys.
Well, for the average citizen buying groceries or paying rent, the state's cushion absorbs the immediate shock.
Right.
But for the state itself, the entity trying to map out a 20-year infrastructure plan or fund a universal healthcare system, volatility is an administrative nightmare.
I can imagine.
Imagine trying to budget for a massive new university complex when your national revenue might drop by 40% next year. Or it might double.
You're flying blind.
The footnotes in the International Monetary Fund data actually reveal a quirk that highlights this chaos perfectly.
I noticed those footnotes. Kuwait had to repeatedly change its financial year structure.
Yeah, it's fascinating. In the late 1960s and early 70s, the fiscal year ran from July to June.
Okay.
Then in 1974, they shifted to an April through March schedule, which created a really strange overlapping transition period.
Just to align the budgets.
Right. And decades later, they reverted back to July-June. Then, in the year 2000, they ran a transitional 9-month financial year just to reset the calendar back to an April-March schedule.
That sounds like an accounting department in total freefall.
It really does.
It shows the sheer administrative friction of managing wealth that you don't fully control, because the price is set by global markets thousands of miles away.
Exactly. Aligning domestic budgeting and state expenditure becomes incredibly complex.
And all that wealth, volatile as it is, acts as a massive magnet for human beings.
Right.
Which brings us to the demographic explosion in this data.
Right. The population skyrockets from roughly 310,000 in 1960 to nearly 4.3 million in 2023.
Wow. Think about your own day-to-day life if you're listening to this. Think about the town or city you live in right now.
Yeah, just picture it.
Imagine multiplying its population by 10 over just a few decades. The roads, the plumbing, the grocery stores, the power grid.
The physical density must become overwhelming, especially since we know they are constrained to that narrow coastal urban footprint.
Because they can't build into the desert.
Exactly. The spatial reality means this 10x population multiplier is being squeezed into a very specific, limited geographic area.
And the composition of that population is just as striking as the sheer numbers, right?
Absolutely. We see a massive youth demographic. The structural metrics point to an incredibly high youth dependency ratio compared to the old age dependency ratio.
Let's unpack the dependency ratio for a second. The working age population, which is usually defined as ages 15 to 64, is the economic engine.
Right, they're producing value.
A high youth dependency ratio means that engine is carrying a massive wave of young people under the age of 15.
The working age population, and by extension the state itself, carries a heavy burden. They have to rapidly scale up education, build housing, provide pediatric health care,
All simultaneously.
and eventually they have to find a way to absorb all of those youths into the labor market.
It really is like a wildly successful tech startup.
How do you mean?
Well, you go from 30 employees to 3,000 practically overnight. The valuation is sky high, the founders are thrilled, but suddenly you realize you only have 2 bathrooms, the server keeps crashing, and you have no HR department.
That's a perfect way to put it.
The state has to scale its infrastructure at a breakneck pace just to keep up with the bodies walking through the door.
And when you look at the demographic charts of older Western democracies, you see relatively flat birth rates in an aging population. It's a slow, predictable demographic curve.
Very manageable.
But the charts for Kuwait, particularly in the 1970s and 80s, show explosive growth lines. It is a demographic shockwave.
Once that shockwave of young people graduates from these rapidly built state-of-the-art schools, where do they go?
That is the big question.
Because you can't farm, there's virtually no domestic manufacturing. What does a job even look like in this environment?
The data on the labor market reveals the core social contract of the state. Over 70% of employment is in the service sector.
70%.
And agriculture is chronically under 1%.
Yeah.
But the most telling statistic is the nature of the employment itself. Over 96% of workers are salaried employees.
Wait, 96%?
Yes. Self-employment or entrepreneurial non-salaried work is practically non-existent in the statistical aggregate.
That is staggering. So if 96% of the country is working salaried jobs, mostly in the public sector, doesn't that inherently level the playing field for women?
What do you mean by that?
Well, you're removing the historical physical labor barriers, right, like mining or heavy farming,
Yeah.
and replacing them with standardized bureaucratic hiring practices.
That is a brilliant deduction, and the data absolutely bears that out.
Really?
Yeah. The Gender Parity Index, or GPI, in education shows women actually outpacing men in higher education enrollment.
Oh, wow.
The index for tertiary education is consistently over 1.0, meaning more women are enrolled than men. We also see a steady rise in the percentage of women in mid to senior management positions.
It makes complete sense. If heavy physical labor is out of the picture and the core of the economy is knowledge-based and service-based, the historical barriers to female workforce participation just evaporate.
Exactly. The state provides safe, structured, salaried environments in ministries, schools, and hospitals.
So it's a massive victory for human capital development.
It is. The state takes the immense oil wealth, and instead of just handing out cash checks, it creates public administration and service jobs.
Distributing the wealth through guarantees employment.
Right. Through benefits and stability.
But the trade-off is that it completely stifles entrepreneurship. I mean, why risk your livelihood, your capital, and your time starting a private business when you have a comfortable, highly lucrative, guaranteed salary waiting for you in a government ministry?
You wouldn't. It creates an incredibly educated but rigid workforce. People enter the public service sector and they stay there.
It is a profound structural reality. And this massive investment by the state into its population extends heavily into public health, too, leading to what we can call the modernization paradox.
The absolute wins here are staggering. I mean, life expectancy surges from about 60 years in 1960 to around 80 years today.
A 20-year gain in an average lifespan, that's monumental.
And it is mirrored in the mortality rates. The World Bank data for infant and under 5 mortality rates shows a drastic drop.
What kind of numbers are we talking about?
Well, in the 1970s, the uncertainty bounds for infant mortality showed rates well over 50 deaths per 1,000 live births.
Which is really high.
But as the wealth poured in and the state built modern healthcare infrastructure, those rates plummeted to single digits, hovering around 6.6 to 7.2 in recent years.
So they used the massive capital to build state-of-the-art hospitals, secure clean water, implement universal access, and basically wipe out the traditional poverty-driven health crises of the 19th and 20th centuries.
Exactly. But the extensive footnotes in our data stack reveal something else. They show the establishment of the Kuwait Nutrition Surveillance System, or KNSS.
Right, the local tracker.
This local system continuously monitors public health metrics. It tracks traditional issues like stunting and wasting, which, by the way, are very low.
Thankfully.
But it heavily monitors overweight and obesity metrics among both men and women.
Yeah, I saw those 95% confidence intervals tracking female overweight percentages year after year.
It's a concerning trend.
It's like the transition from horse-drawn carriages to automobiles. You invent the car to solve the massive public health problem of horse manure in the city streets.
Yeah.
Brilliant.
Right.
But in doing so, you accidentally create a 21st century problem. Traffic jams and smog. They conquered infant mortality with wealth and infrastructure, but the KNSS data shows they are now battling the side effects of their own success.
That's the modernization paradox. It's driven by the very environment and economy that solved the first set of problems.
Explain how the environment plays into it.
Well, we have a population living in an extreme desert climate, forcing people indoors into air-conditioned environments for a significant portion of the year.
The habitable modules of the space station.
Exactly. Add to that universal urbanization, no one is out working the land. Combine that with a labor market where 96% of people work in salaried, largely sedentary service sector jobs.
Sitting at desks.
And top it all off with high per capita wealth, leading to high caloric availability and consumption.
It's a perfect storm for metabolic issues. A sedentary, indoor lifestyle with access to whatever food you want.
The state saved the population from infectious diseases, but the geography and the economy have forced them to pivot to managing chronic lifestyle-induced diseases.
Like cardiovascular disease and diabetes.
Exactly. And the environment isn't just affecting human health through a sedentary lifestyle. The air itself is under immense pressure.
Yeah, let's talk about the air quality data.
PM 2.5 exposure, which is the fine particulate matter that deeply penetrates the lungs, is at extremely high levels, well beyond World Health Organization guidelines.
Going back to our analogy, it's like finding out the life support system on the space station is slowly pumping carbon into the air supply. They have the money to fix it, but the exhaust is coming from the very engine keeping them in orbit.
The high PM 2.5 here is a really complex intersection. You have the natural inescapable dust and sand from the surrounding desert, so the geography itself contributes to the baseline particulate matter.
You can't avoid the sand.
Right. But you combine that natural dust with heavy industrial emissions from the petroleum sector, the massive energy generation required to keep the grid running, and the vehicle emissions from an entirely car-dependent urban sprawl.
Because, frankly, no one is walking to work in 115-degree heat.
No, definitely not.
But looking at the energy grid, the metric measuring renewable energy generation as a percentage of total generation is practically zero.
Yes.
Fossil fuels account for virtually 100% of energy consumption, which is wild to me. If you are the government and you know your air quality is hazardous and you have blazing sun all year round, why aren't there solar panels on every single roof?
The answer lies in an economic concept known as resource curse inertia.
Resource curse inertia. Okay.
When a state is sitting on massive reserves of fossil fuels, the domestic cost of extracting and burning that fuel for its own use is incredibly low.
It's just right there.
It is virtually free compared to global market prices.
So the short-term economic calculus always favors the incumbent fuel. Why spend billions of dollars building an entirely new solar or wind infrastructure when you can just pipe virtually free gas to the power plant next door?
Exactly. The immediate incentive to change is incredibly low, even if the long-term risk is existential.
Right.
The world is slowly transitioning away from oil, and their own population is suffering from poor air quality, but the short-term cost-benefit analysis keeps the system locked in place.
Changing a grid that is 100% reliant on a single cheap domestic source requires an act of immense political and institutional will.
It really does.
And to execute that kind of massive structural pivot to override short-term economics for long-term survival, a country needs incredibly effective institutions.
Which brings us to the Worldwide Governance Indicators, or WGI, in our data stack.
Yeah, let's look at that. The data on control of corruption shows percentile rankings that fluctuate historically. It goes up, it goes down.
Right.
Let's unpack how to actually read these indicators. Because when the corruption score fluctuates, does that literally mean people are handing over more bribes one year and fewer the next?
Not necessarily. Usually, in a developing or modernizing state, these fluctuations reflect the intense friction of institutional reform.
Okay, friction.
These indicators are impartial aggregates of views from businesses, citizens, and expert surveys. Imagine the state attempting to modernize its bureaucracy.
Like trying to digitize procurement.
Exactly. Or streamline licensing to encourage that private entrepreneurship we noted was missing earlier.
So you're trying to make the bureaucracy more efficient and transparent, but in doing so, you disrupt existing power structure.
Right. The elite interests who benefited from the old opaque system resist the changes.
That political push and pull creates noise in the system that surveys pick up as fluctuating governance quality. It's literally the sound of the gears grinding as they try to shift directions.
That's a great way to put it. The data also shows regulatory quality ranking in the upper middle globally, indicating clear room for optimization.
Room to improve.
And the metrics for voice and accountability track the complex shifts in how the public participates in this unique state structure.
Which brings up a fascinating point, actually. How does public participation function in a wealthy, single commodity state where nobody pays income taxes, but almost everyone gets a government salary?
It's completely inverted.
Yeah. The whole democratic dynamic of no taxation without representation gets flipped on its head. How does the social contract change when the government funds the people rather than the people funding the government?
That is the core tension of their governance model. And the mandate for policymakers looking at this multidimensional data stack is incredibly complex.
What's the main takeaway for them?
The overarching conclusion is a balance of profound strengths and existential vulnerabilities. They have a highly educated workforce, massive capital reserves, and a population that has conquered historical health crises.
But their energy grid, their revenue stream, and their entire social contract, all those guaranteed salaried government jobs, are entirely dependent on one depleting resource.
Exactly. If we synthesize the policy recommendations based purely on resolving the tensions in this data narrative, it comes down to three massive overhauls.
Okay, what's the first one?
First, they must accelerate economic diversification to break the natural resource rent dependency.
They have to build something else.
Second, they need a complete overhaul of environmental governance to address the PM 2.5 levels and integrate renewables.
Get the air quality under control.
And third, they have to optimize the labor market to gently move that highly educated, massive youth population out of the state-sponsored service sector and into dynamic private enterprises.
We started today looking at a geography that honestly shouldn't support a massive population, which forced the creation of a hyper-urbanized space station-like society.
Right.
We saw how a 100% service economy is powered entirely by the very resource that brings it immense wealth, but also environmental peril.
It's a delicate balance.
And we unpacked the incredible paradoxical victories, how state wealth elevated female education and eradicated infant mortality, only to collide with the 21st century realities of sedentary lifestyles and complex nutritional challenges.
It is a society living at the very edge of extreme wealth and extreme geography.
Yeah.
And it brings us to a lingering question that the historical data cannot definitively answer, but the trends demand we ask.
Which is?
If we look at the global macroeconomic forecasts, the transition to electric vehicles, the aggressive push for green energy across Europe and Asia, what happens if global demand for oil is halved over the next 30 years?
Wow. What becomes of a nation whose very geography dictates it cannot grow its own food or harvest its own rainwater when the value of its single export drops permanently?
Will their ultimate export have to shift from fossil fuels to the intellectual capital of that highly educated urbanized youth population we saw in the demographic data?
Can human capital replace natural capital in the desert? That is the multi-billion-dollar question, something for you to think about. Thank you for taking this deep dive into the numbers that define a nation and the geography that shapes its destiny. Until next time.